About the new galleries, some of the new galleries at Perth Museum. Yes, 2017 we started that project, and a lot, I think the sector moved a long way in that time as well, particularly about how we begin to frame collections, non-domestic collections. Collections in Perth which were categorized as ethnographic when I first started, and which are now kind of termed, I still think slightly problematically, world cultures. So if I use the term world cultures, it's with giant inverted commas. So I suppose I'd like to talk about how the new museum and the opportunity presented by this new museum explores and examines some of the histories and legacies of empire, and some of the, I suppose, models and methods that we tried out to begin to pick apart an extremely sensitive, complex, contentious set of stories. And I'd like to do that by focusing, because of where we are, focusing on three instruments that are part of those collections and are part of the displays. And when I was thinking about selecting these three instruments as a kind of prism to explore a set of methodologies, I was a bit reticent and a bit worried that that might be reductive. But the more I thought about it, the more it occurred to me that musical instruments are actually a very articulate way of exploring colonial violence and the role of museums in perpetrating partial views of history. I mean, you think about a traditional museum display of an instrument. It's an instrument in a glass case. You don't have any access to how it sounded, how you meant to play it, what kind of music it made, whether you play it ensemble, what kind of context is it played in? Is it played in, I don't know, court setting, kind of domestic setting? This is kind of critical information to be able to develop any kind of understanding of what this object is for. And I think more broadly, musical instruments in world cultures collections embody a particular kind of trauma that is a result of the colonial project, and that is the loss of intangible culture. And we have instances, countless instances of cultural suppression as part of colonial projects. So this might be the loss of language. This could be the loss of folk traditions. This could be the loss of cooking recipes. And more often than not, it's represented in the loss of music. And one of the third object, which I'll come to, is a direct example of that loss, and the ways in which source communities and museums working for those source communities can try to repair some of that damage, to reclaim some of that lost intangible culture. But before we get there, I'm going to give you a bit of context. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the museum project. I'm going to talk about the building that the new museum is housed in, which might sound irrelevant to this topic, but the history of that building was, I suppose, instrumental in orchestrating how we approached broader interpretation in the museum displays and in this display in particular. I'm going to talk a bit about the collections. Why is this material in Perth? And then we'll look at the three objects. So this is Perth Museum. For anybody who hasn't been, Perth is 45 miles north of Edinburgh. Population 50,000. the center of quite a large rural hinterland of about 140,000. And this building was a civic hall, closed in 2005, and has basically been empty until the start of this project. It went through a few different options. It was going to be a kind of food market, a hotel. It was going to get demolished to make a kind of European-style piazza, which was optimistic. The Perth and Kinross Council decided to turn it into a museum. And partly this was a response to the fact that, like so many city centres, economic activity was changing. And the retail activity was basically really suffering. And this was seen as a way, investment in heritage was seen as a way of driving footfall into the city centre and reorientating the city centre economy. Part of that business case, I suppose, was the relocation of the Stone of Destiny from just up the road in Edinburgh Castle to form the centre point of Perth Museum. If you don't know what the Stone of Destiny is, don't worry, but Google it afterwards, because I can't go into it now. That's another talk. So Perth Museum opened in March last year. The building itself, as I say, was a concert hall. 1911, sitting on the site of a previous concert hall or civic hall called the Old City Centre, the Old Perth City Hall, slap bang in the city centre, next to the spiritual heart of Perth, which is the medieval Kirk St John's. And as I say, this building has been empty since 2005. As a social history barometer, Perth City Hall is a very interesting way of gauging how people from Perth and more broadly what they're interested in, what their values are, what their political ideologies are, what the kind of rupture points in public discourse are at any given time. It was host to countless gigs, record sales, wrestling matches, ceilidhs, school concerts. And when I say a social history barometer, I'll give a few examples. So the 1910s, there's a lot of evidence of suffragette activity. 1930s, pro and anti-fascist demonstrations happening there. 1970s, disco dancing competitions. So you look at the program for that venue and you get a little sample of what is exercising people at the time. The 1845 building, which was on that site, had exactly the same function. So Charles Dickens spoke there, Jenny Lind, the famous Swedish singer, sang there. And as a way of gauging Victorian sensibilities, very complicated, very paradoxical sensibilities towards empire and race, this building, and well, the predecessor of this building, is quite interesting. So 1845, Frederick Douglass speaks there. The American abolitionist speaks there on a number of occasions to packed crowds. 1877, the Fisk University Singers, this gospel group comprising of formerly enslaved people, comes from America and performs that, effectively introducing gospel music to the UK as part of that tour. But also, while these things are happening and while anti-slavery groups are being formed and speaking there, minstrel shows are happening there and human zoos are happening there. So this is a really interesting place to explore the social history of Perth and Kinross. And the story of empire is absolutely intrinsic to the experience of people in the history of Perth and Kinross. And there was an imperative in developing these new galleries, this is the new museum, to research and represent hidden histories and marginalized perspectives. that was absolutely critical to reinterpreting and re-energizing the collection of Perth and Kinross, which is one of the oldest in the UK, 1784. Founded by the Perth Literary and Antiquarian Society, classic Enlightenment organization, empiricism, rationalism, education through amassing material and public showcasing of this material. The building on the right is their 1824 museum, which is now integrated into Perth Art Gallery. When they're initially founded, they're focusing on what they call Scottish antiquities, which means basically archaeology. But their collecting habits become quite omnivorous, and it's not long before they're collecting fine art, natural history, decorative art, and cultural material from across the world. Cultural material that is being sent back by people from Perth and Kinross. And 1780s into the 19th century, this is a period of rapid, very active expansion in the British imperial project. And people from Perth, people from Scotland, people from across the UK and across Europe are taking the opportunity that expanding empire presents, and they're working and settling and interacting with people and cultures that they haven't in such numbers interacted with before. Interacting is a euphemism. When we started researching particularly these galleries, and we were looking at the accession registers for the new museum, the really profound link between episodes of British imperial expansion and episodes of collecting and expansion of the museum collection were strikingly apparent. And that's kind of an obvious thing, you know. Someone invades somewhere, that unlocks access to cultural material that is then shipped back. But to see that in black and white in an accession register was quite powerful. And to give you a few examples, 1799, the fall of Seringapatam, the pillaging of Seringapatam, the death of Tipu Sultan, the end of the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War. Within a year, material from Mysore is being accessioned into the Perth collection, and many other museums in the UK, notably the V&A. May 1841, the British Navy are very busy laying siege to Canton during the First Opium War. Capitulation follows, and a year later, a lot of Chinese material enters the Perth collection. And my final example, 1879, the Battle of Isan Luana, despite the British Army being heavily defeated by the Zulu Army, inevitably within a few months, Zulu material begins to enter the Perth collection. So I suppose my point in raising these episodes is to illustrate how plugged in museum collections are to episodes of colonial expansion. And perhaps more importantly, when we look at this material, they are evidence, they are the consequence of imperial violence, not in any kind of abstract sense, like actual episodes of violence. So how do we navigate that? How do we interpret that? How do we explore those stories? Stories which have been, I would say, largely ignored for most of the time that material has been in Perth, and equivalent material has been in equivalent institutions around the UK. When this is a picture of the inside of that rotunda, the Literary and Antiquarian Society Museum. And I'd like to talk a little bit about museums' role in perpetrating that colonial violence. Something that museums have been extremely reluctant to confront until recently. This material is quite crudely documented and is displayed completely out of context in a kind of comparative taxonomic scheme. Let's put a hat from China next to a hat from South Africa next to a Coast Salish hat. You're basically creating a qualitative schema and a totally decontextualized and arbitrary schema, which is absolutely explicit in stating that look at this plethora of cultural material, but European civilization, European culture is superior to all of this. These represents the stages, the evolution of European culture. And for anybody who would dispute how explicit that is, my second example is a pretty graphic illustration of a white supremacist thread that runs throughout the collecting and interpretation of this material. So the New Museum the New Museum project represented an opportunity to address some of these injustices, address some of these histories which had been completely hidden. And it offered methods of exploring a history of empire, of collections as repositories of colonial violence, and, as I say, to begin to attempt to heal some of the scars that these objects represent. So each object, each instrument represents a slightly different kind of trajectory for this new treatment in the New Museum. And I suppose the first two objects I kind of term a passive treatment. So the first object is I'm presenting to you as evidence of colonial violence, and it's presented in the gallery as evidence of colonial violence. So that's really focusing in on the circumstances of acquisition, the context in which it's acquired. The second object I'm presenting as evidence of the fundamentally racist conceptual framework which justifies the collection of a given object, and actually justifies the violence in the first place. And then the third object, I suppose, is I term a kind of active treatment, which is looking at the fact that empire and museums as a kind of cultural mechanism operate on the basis of a gross power imbalance. These objects are the result of cultural interaction, but that's cultural interaction that's extremely biased in where the power resides. And the third example is looking at ways in which that power imbalance can be addressed and where curatorial authority, for example, can be shifted. So, loot is a very interesting word and is not a provocation. It's an accurate application. Loot is a Hindi word which entered the English language in the second half of the 18th century. John Ferguson of the East India Company compiled a dictionary of the Hindustan language in 1773, and his definition of loot is booty, depredation, spoil, plunder, and pillage. this word enters the English language in the context of the East India Company's expanding activities in, to begin with, northern and then eastern, and then the whole of India and the subcontinent. The East India Company merits hundreds of hours of talk. I really struggled with this bit to try and illustrate how jaw-dropping the East India Company's story is. This is a private company with shareholders. This is a corporate enterprise with a private army of 200,000 soldiers, double the size of the British Army, that is presiding over the Indian subcontinent. By the 1830s, it's presiding over the Indian subcontinent. And in this period, in 1773, 8 years earlier, it's gained the right to tax, to gather tax in Bengal, which means that it goes from being a corporate body, trading, a little bit of war on the side, a lot of war actually on the side, but it goes to being effectively a government. It goes to being a government body responsible for the lives of millions of people, but actually only beholden to its shareholders and the profit imperative. This story is astonishing. How a private, this is Amazon and Google presiding over the lives, this is Amazon and Google presiding over the government of one of the most economically productive regions of the world, millions and millions of people, but with a degree of corporate negligence that results in the total hollowing out of society, the economy, the deaths of millions of people, and the large-scale removal of wealth from India to the UK. My first object has a EIC, East India Company connection, so we'll expand a bit on that. This is a random slide. This is Luti. This is Queen Victoria's Pekingese, who was removed from the Summer Palace during its destruction and pillaging by the British Army in October 1860, and presented to Queen Victoria to form part of the Royal Collection of Dogs. And I've included Luti here because I think that the fact that that's what the dog was called is a demonstration of how normalized in the 18th and 19th century wide-scale pillaging of other countries' cultural assets was. This is totally fine. So, my first object, a musical instrument. This is a crocodile zither, a mi-kyong, from present-day Myanmar. And I suppose this instrument is really exploring the first thread in that gallery, which is exploring the circumstances, specific circumstances of acquisition. So, rather than kind of demonstrate in general terms, which can be quite abstract, the ideas of pillage, this gallery focuses on one or two objects and explores the exact circumstances in which they were acquired. But a little bit about this instrument first. This is known as the Mon harp, because it originated with the Mon people in southern Myanmar. At one point, it was very broadly played, but now is really exclusively played in southern Myanmar. It used to have 6 strings. The pegs are still there, as you can see at the back, but this is played on the ground flat with a plectrum, and is played in an ensemble for quite kind of formal court chamber music. Why is it in Perth? It's in Perth because of this guy, Major General Sir Archibald Stuart. So, I need to keep an eye on time because I will rattle on with this. It's the 1820s. The East India Company preside over a huge swathe of the subcontinent, and immediately adjacent to their economic powerhouse in the Bengal Presidency, that is Calcutta, or Kolkata now, is a nation which isn't part of their scope and remit, and that is the Kingdom of Burma, also known at this time as the Court of Ava. And the East India Company are eyeing up Burma for a number of reasons. 3 reasons, principally. 1, Burma represents a new market to expand into. 2, they're worried that the French are going to get there, and the French are going to start trading. 3, they do not like the idea of a militaristic, independent, quite powerful kingdom so close to their economic powerhouse. So, this man, Archibald Stuart of Glenlyon in Highland Perthshire, is tasked by the army to invade. And after a series of cross-border skirmishes, he leads a pretty enormous land force from an army point of view, as well as from a Burmese point of view, catastrophic march through monsoons, sustaining huge casualties and very widely pillaging and destroying sacred sites on the way to Rangoon, or now Yangon. There are a number of objects in the Perth collection and on display in Perth Museum that are attached to this specific episode, and we don't need to because it's reported at the time, but we can track the progress north to Rangoon through the objects that are collected. So in the south, there is the crocodiles are there. Then they stop off and pillage some Buddhist caves, from which we have a carved gilt elephant tusk. And then finally pillage the pagoda in Rangoon, from which there are a number of objects in the Perth collection. At this point, I just want to, without honouring in any way, trust me, Archibald Stuart, I want to quote his view of the campaign. Bearing in mind this was the most expensive military campaign in British Indian history. He has this to say. Their haughty leader, so this is Masha Bandula, the Burmese commander, their haughty leader had insolently declared his intention of leading us in captive chains to grace the triumph of the Golden Monarch. But it has pleased God to expose the vanity of his idle threats and crown the heroic efforts of my gallant little army with a most complete and signal victory. My Europeans fought like Britons, and the sepoys, so those are the Indian soldiers who are fighting for the British, and the sepoys strove to obtain the palm of honour by endeavouring to rival their European comrades in everything that marks the steady, true and daring soldier. Never was victory more complete or more decided. The loss of the enemy was beyond the possibility of calculation. Of their mighty host, scarcely a vestige existed, but that remnant, such as it was, had commenced in its inglorious fight, humbled, disarmed, and dispersed, a salutary antidote to the native arrogance and vanity of the Burmese nation. So by the end of the 20s, Stuart's back in the UK. He's got quite a lot of money. He has a lot of Burmese material in his personal collection. And in 1831, as a gesture of beneficence to his home region, he gifts this material to the Literary and Antiquarian Society, who put it on display. So this object, I think, is a good gateway into understanding some of the circumstances in which material ends up here. The second musical instrument is Nayamban. This is a Persian bagpipe. And I'm using this example to illustrate the conceptual framework that is underpinning the display of this material in museums. How are these objects being understood, interpreted, and displayed? First, a little bit about the Nayamban itself. It's made of wood, metal, and camel leather. It's from Persia. The picture on the left is the pipe. So it's a double melodic pipe. These are the finger holes. And then on the right, you've got the mouthpiece, and it's played ostensibly as you play a Scottish bagpipe. It enters the collection in 1831 and is donated by someone called James Reid, who is from Perth. He's one of three brothers. All three brothers are involved either in the army or in the East India Company. James is a surgeon in the East India Company and is sent on the British mission to Persia. This is a diplomatic mission, and it's basically, the point of the mission is that the East India Company and the British government, I should have mentioned the fact that a significant number of MPs were shareholders in the East India Company, which might have influenced government policy. The East India Company are worried about Russia's increasing belligerence to the north of India, and they're worried about how that is going to interrupt the steady flow of wealth from India to Great Britain. So a diplomatic mission is sent to Persia to see how Persia can be used as effectively a buffer zone. Reid goes to Persia. His time there, aside from the numerous objects that he sends to the Literary and Antiquarian Society in Perth, his time there is also evidenced by his graffiti. He carved his name into the ruins of the Palace of Darius in Persepolis. He and his brothers were all donors to the Literary and Antiquarian Society, and often when these donors gave material to the museum collection, they'd add a kind of justification. So there'd be a little bit about how, there'd be a preamble about how, I'm sending this back to my home city as an expression of gratitude. This is an interesting thing. You might want to consider it for your museum. And Reid writes a long letter attached to the Nayamban, justifying and exploring and I suppose gauging the society's appetite to accept the object. I'm going to give his own words because this is one of the most graphic articulations of white supremacy that I've ever come across in a museum record. So he starts. Its close resemblance in form, as well as in the character of the music produced from it, to the more improved instrument of the same name in Scotland, forms its chief and perhaps its only point of interest, and certainly these constitute the only reasons I have for presuming to suppose that so very rude an instrument could possibly be acceptable. If, however, the latter conjecture is correct, and provided the Society will receive the present as proof of my desire to contribute to its museum,
it will be a source of gratification to me when any other opportunity allows me of adding my mite to the antiquarian stores with which my native city is already enriched. The difference between the very rude instrument now offered to the society and the imposing, handsome, warlike bagpipe of Scotland is very striking, but there seems little reason to doubt that the former is the true original of the latter. These two may well represent the present state of the inhabitants of the representative countries of Britain and Persia in which they are now found. The former, free, civilized, and enlightened, are yet in rapid and accelerating progress towards still incalculable improvements in all that is worthy of men and immortal creatures, while among the latter, the dark ignorance of the earliest ages has not only been perpetuated, but the unceasing oppressions of absolute tyrants and the benumbing influence of a false religion appear to have totally eradicated even those cheering symptoms of advancement and civilization which shone on this and the neighboring countries above 1,000 years ago, and still retain the millions of these beautiful regions of the earth in the most debasing and brutifying state of demoralization and disgusting slavery. There it is. Yes. So anyway, I present the Nyamban as a very articulate example of the racist underpinnings that justify the removal of this material and its display and interpretation in museums. And before I move on to this object, and museums' role as the museum's role in the apparatus of these kinds of ideologies that justify empire. My final object represents, I suppose, an active treatment in the sense of how museums today can use collections today to begin to address these injustices. And it represents how that power imbalance that I spoke about earlier can be rebalanced. This is Putorino, a Maori Tonga. Maori Tonga means a Maori treasure. And Perth has a very early and very significant collection of Maori Tonga. And as a result, has cultivated over the last 20 years a close collaborative partnership with Te Papa Tongaroa, which is the National Museum of New Zealand. And this started in 2005 with the repatriation of 2 human heads, Toimoko, from Aotearoa, from Perth, back to New Zealand. And those initial conversations sparked a set of relationships and a set of research projects, which developed and grew, and I suppose as trust built between respective parties, more information and more collaboration was possible, including consultation on conservation of Maori collections in Perth. This is a Maori cloak, kahu kakapua, made from the feathers of the night parrot, the kakapo. I think it's probably the only one in existence. It's a high status object and of enormous spiritual significance to Maori people. So when it came to conserving this object for display in the new museum, we were led by our colleagues in New Zealand who dictated the parameters of treatment. I'll talk a little bit more about that relationship and how it informs the displays in Perth Museum in a bit, but first to look at the putoruno. This is a flute, a tonga puoro. Tonga puoro is a reference to rhythmic and wind instruments that are used in Maori communities for healing, for marking important events, and as a communication mechanism between people and the player and the spirit world. As with so many colonized peoples and their practices, Tonga Puoro was suppressed during the colonial period, as was Maori language, te reo. But in the 1980s, a group called Hamanu started to revive Tonga Puoro practices by visiting museums and looking at Puoro in the collections. The kind of gross paradox of imperialism being that these communities couldn't access that material culture because it had been actively hollowed out and denuded and transplanted, or the material evidence transplanted to museums across the world. So the only way to access that lost heritage was by going to these places and these repositories. As you'll see, it's made of wood with carvings. This one is quite unusual. The Perth one is quite unusual. The image on the left, you'll see that the hair hanging down is dog hair, and signifies that it was a prestige object. Moving back to the relationship and the recalibration of that power dynamic. Curatorial authority is absolutely intrinsic to how power is articulated in museums, and deciding where that curatorial authority lies. Who gets to tell you about these objects? Who gets to tell you about these stories? Who gets to decide which objects are displayed? And that has been the sole remit of, in the Perth collection, white curators with no cultural background in Maori culture. So, as part of the developing relationship with Te Papa and Maori curators, we signed a memorandum of understanding which effectively signified the transference of curatorial sovereignty for these objects to curators in New Zealand, Maori curators in New Zealand, acting on behalf of communities in New Zealand. And by curatorial authority and responsibility, I mean that when it came to developing these displays, our colleagues in New Zealand were responsible for selecting the objects, designing the case, interpreting the objects, deciding what touchscreen AV content there would be, deciding lighting regimes for objects, orientation. And that's not to say, we left the room and, weren't involved, because these decisions are being made thousands of miles away. The Perth team were responsible for facilitating that curatorial authority and impetus. That extended into a broader set of I suppose, cultural protocols. Western museums have kind of very particular guidelines on things like environmental controls, security controls, interpretation hierarchies. We have sets of protocols about how we write emails, for example. These protocols were put to one side, and the project was entirely reframed within Maori norms. And by that I mean
if we needed to move an object out of the collection store, it needed to be accompanied by a Maori prayer. So Maori representatives would come into the museum stores, they would perform a ceremony, the museum would be taken to the conservation studio, treated, and then taken to the museum. When we opened the display, we were fortunate enough to get funding for a lot of our colleagues from Te Papa to come to the installation and the opening of the museum. And prior to the opening of the museum itself, we opened the gallery with a dawn ceremony. And even we had a lot of late night and early morning Zoom calls, as you can probably imagine. And those Zoom calls would start with a karakia, which is a Maori prayer. Our email correspondence, salutations and sign-offs would be in te reo. And that was very good for the Perth project team to understand that actually everything that you assume is universal is contingent. And actually there are other ways of interacting. And to emphasize the sovereignty of the Maori perspective in the development of this gallery, small things like that were extremely important. I am very conscious that I'm talking about curatorial voices, and you have only heard my voice, and that you're looking at instruments that you can't hear. So I want to play you a video, and this is the kind of final word of this talk, which features Dr. Afina Tamarapa, who was the project lead for the development of the Maori displays, and who has been the key contact in the Perth Aotearoa relationship. So I'm going to very clumsily close this. Well, if you're interested, go to Perth Museum, because this video is, it was one of a suite that we commissioned with Te Papa. We commissioned Norman Heke, who's a Maori filmmaker. This is obviously a subject which is expensive, and labels in cases and panels on walls don't come close to being able to explore this topic. So these films are pretty instrumental and pretty important in the navigation of these galleries. So definitely go to Perth Museum and watch this excellent film and hear about the Puturino in Afina's own words, because she is the curatorial authority, not me. Thank you.